Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Quack&Co, the channel where everything is under 10 minutes all the time, every time. And today I'm going over 5 ways to be better at mind management. 5 ways to crush the competition. 5 ways to outthink, outmaneuver, and outwit your opponent in mind management. Now, mind management, very quick and general overview. I do assume to some extent you know about the game already, but it's a hidden role game, a hidden movement game, not a hidden role. It's a hidden movement game in which you're going to be taking on the role, or one player is taking on the role of the recruiter. And the recruiter is going to be wandering around the board trying to escape the various agents as they trace their own pathway on their secret board over here, trying to move from location to location to ultimately get the agents they need or outrun the clock. Meanwhile, the agents are trying to slowly close in on you and taking their actions to ask questions, to figure out where you've been, and ultimately to take the action to close the door on you and capture you once and for all. Although, if they're wrong, it's an entirely wasted action, which is awesome for you or for them, depends on who's playing who. That's the general high-level view of the game, and my 5 tips this time, specifically because of the nature of the game, they're going to be divided up. I'm going to have 2 for the recruiter, 2 for the agents, and then 1 for both, although the 1 for both is arguably the least useful of them all. We'll get to it. Timestamps down below, as always, starting off with the first one for the recruiter. Use the Immortals to protect you. This is something I find players do not take advantage of as much as they should. The Immortals, you see, are going to start on the board, and the Immortals have a few things going for them, but one of them, and it's an advanced mode of the game, which I do highly recommend you play the advanced mode. It's significantly better, or the default mode, whatever it is, but I do recommend using the Immortals, and the Immortals in the game are going to have a few things going for you. First of all, they're going to allow you, as the recruiter, to pick up additional agents. You're going to have certain terrain cards, certain feature cards that show you different things, and let's say you're trying to get the suggestive graffiti over there. If you have a recruiter, an immortal, over at the suggestive graffiti over here, and you move another one down here so that you have another one, and then you have 2 of them in the same spot, and boom, you get to recruit another agent because of that. Very helpful. But I find that tends to be the thing that it's used for the most by the recruiter. I find that for the most part, the recruiter does not take advantage as much of the other facets of the Immortals, which is protecting them from the agents being able to ask questions about certain features and to capture you in the game. I find more often than not, because if you effectively have an Immortal on your space as the recruiter, if you have an Immortal on your space, the other players cannot capture you until they eject that recruiter, which means, until they eject that Immortal, which means that inevitably what happens is they have to decide, well, if I think you're in this space and the Immortal is there, I'm going to spend 2 actions to find out if I'm right, and that is much more of a price than I am willing to pay. And so they take other pathways, other options, which effectively means the Immortals are a great tool to protect you, but one that I don't find players utilize as much. They treat the Immortals as a little bit of a slight hindrance to the things they can ask for and as ways to get extra agents. I highly, highly recommend that, especially as the net is closing around you, and in this game the net will slowly close around you, I highly recommend you take advantage of the Immortals and specifically make sure that they are going on the spots that you are going on to make it that much more of a commitment for the enemy agents to figure out where you are. Tip number 2 for the agents. Don't undervalue slow detective work. It's a big part of this game. I find that people often go for the flashy moments of any number of things, using her action to say, are you within 2 of me? Or trying to figure out, where are you asking questions about where you've been that aren't necessarily helpful at any given time. Actually taking capture actions that don't actually capture somebody. And if you're wrong, if you're right, it would have been super cool. But if you're wrong, it wastes time. Don't undervalue the process of slow detective work. In mind management, what's going to happen is the recruiter is going to feel like they have the upper hand for the first half of the game. But if you do your job correctly, if you spend that time asking those questions, if you always constantly and frequently ask about features, have you visited the umbrellas, have you visited the tikis, have you visited the coffee shop, any number of these different things, if you consistently ask the questions and then make sure to actually go a step further and ask, what turn were you on the spot? What turn? Oh, is turn 6? Well, that's going to be super helpful to know, because that really defines a lot more where you could or couldn't have been. It narrows the trap around you. Go through the process of the slow detective work, figuring out what's going on. Take your time with it. You're not in a rush, at least not until these agents over here start, these recruits start disappearing. You're not in a rush at first. Take your time as the agents. Do not undervalue slow detective work. Number 3, as the recruiter, use the temples to dash across the board. You see, you have 2 temples on the board, which effectively means that in a handful, in a few actions, as the recruiter, you can go 1, 2, 3, and be completely across the board. This can happen during your initial setup, or it can happen as the game progresses. That specific pathway of 1, 2, 3 across the board, I find is so tempting and isn't utilized enough. But what happens, if you do use that, if you use the temples effectively, if you use the temples to start widening the gap of movement, and you plan around that when you're planning out your initial route over here, I find the enemy agents do not fully take it into account. They consider it, they do. Often when I'm playing the game, people are like, well, you could have also gone that far because of the temples. But they usually cast their net much shorter. They usually cast their net much shorter, and if you double this up and combine it with the fact that you can use your special moves to jump across the map again, jumping from here across there and then back to there can really put people off their tracks. It can give them no real idea of where you are and what you've done in the game. Go for those large jumps in movement. While you might sit there and think, well, it's the obvious move and they're going to track this and track that, the end result is that you are in a whole new quadrant of the map, a whole new area that they have to begin their detective work again because they can't trace that established path line, and you can't cross over your own stuff. So being in your own localized corner means you have less freedom in terms of these spots you can move because you've already gone on those spots. Take advantage of those moves. Take advantage of large jumps. Use the temples as much as possible. Dash across the board. Use your special powers. Use them a lot and frequently to heavily navigate the map and to give you the wide amounts of freedom necessary to do whatever you want, as opposed to the 3 or 4 moves that make sense given the prior constrictions you have in place. Tip number 4, specifically for the agents this time. Use your guy over here, can't remember his name, but use your speed guy last in the game. Use him last as your last action as you go. You see, as you go through the game, you're going to be taking actions with 2 agents a turn. You're going to be using one agent, moving them down, using another agent, turning it down, and then going back and forth, taking 2 cycles before you refresh all your agents and begin again. The problem is, what happens in this game a lot is as you start getting towards that endgame, as you start narrowing the gap of where the recruiter is and what he's doing, you can find yourself in a problem where you've figured out exactly where they are, you've narrowed it down, and you can't get to them. And that can be crushing, knowing where they are, understanding that you finally closed it. You know that they're in this spot, but you have no agent close enough to actually narrow that gap. It's hard. It's hard to figure out the puzzle and still not be able to win. But this character over here will allow you to do that. You see, his special action is that he can grant extra movement to agents, and if you use him on a last turn, and if you combine that with the fact that you've also spent time and energy figuring out what the recruiter's cards are, you can give even further extra movement. Using him last and saving him as your last action will usually result in you not being in that position where you know what's going on and it's too late for you to do anything about it. Always use him for your last set of activations. Do not use him for your first one, and you'll find that you do not end up in that situation nearly as frequently. And tip number 5 for both sides time, and this time it's WIFOM. WIFOM is an abbreviation that stands for the wine in front of me. It's a concept from The Princess Bride, the idea that I know that you know, so that I know that you know. Well, if I know this, then you know that, then you'll choose this. But if I know that you'll choose this, then you'll choose that. It involves us going back and forth. The concept of going back and forth, forever deducing that you would do this, but because you know I would do that, then I'm going to do that. But because you know that I know you're going to do that, you're going to go back to that, and it just goes back and forth forever. Where it applies in mind MGMT and mind management, where it applies as a concept, and we should use it to your advantage, is the fact that frequently players try to take the clever move over the move that seems more obvious. They want to avoid detection, and so when given a choice of 2 moves, they choose the one that seems less obvious. And that's a good thing to do when you first start playing mind management. But as you escalate the game, as you play with players who know it, start shifting back towards the obvious move. Start shifting back. When presented with different choices, don't be as clever as you think you should be, because often the other side is just as clever and they are trying to do the same thing back to you. Figure out what makes sense and go for what makes sense sometimes. Although, of course, in the very nature, and the reason this is the least useful tip, is because of WIFOM. Because of wine in front of me, it means that as you start doing that and as it starts working for you, you have to escalate back to the other side, going back to the less obvious choice because they know that you'll choose that, which means this is a less useful tip because it goes on forever. The idea is figure out who you're playing against. Figure out what they tend to go for. Do they tend to be flashy and clever? Do they like catching you out in your clever moves? Well, then go for the obvious move. Are they a little bit more simple and direct, or they think that you're going to be simple and direct, and as a result they try to chase you down? Well, then go for the flashy move. Whatever the playstyle of your opponent is, match and adjust your playstyle accordingly so that you can win mind management as much as possible. That's basically it. This is one of my favorite games. This is my favorite game from 2021. A fantastic experience. A game I highly recommend. And hopefully these 5 tips give you a little bit more tools at your disposal when you dive down into it to play again. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Quack&Co. And remember, less time watching means more time playing.